in history, with 8 Mr. Olympia titles are Lee Haney and Ronnie Coleman, both black. Now the runners-up, Arnold Schwarzenegger and Phil Heath. Phil Heath, yet again, is another black guy. And his competitor for a long time was Kai Green, which is yet again another black guy. However, when it comes to bodybuilding, it is arguable. Now there's 4 main reasons and 1 factor as well. Now this factor is the genetic diversity in Africa. You see, sub-Saharan Africans are grouped as black people, part of the black race, even though Africa is the most genetically diverse continent in the world. There's only 1.2 billion people in Africa, but they're still more genetically diverse than the 6+ billion people in the rest of the world. So of course, you're likely to find a lot of the genetic extremes in Africa. For example, the tallest people in the world are the Dinka people in South Sudan, which is in Africa. The shortest people in the world are the Mbuti people in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is also in Africa. So it's no surprise then that the fastest and most muscular people are also going to be found in Africa. But understand this, just because they're black doesn't mean they have the same DNA. For example, a man from South India does not have the same DNA as a man from Korea, but they're both Asian. It doesn't mean they have the same DNA. In the same way, black people don't all have the same DNA, even though we're all grouped as black people. That's why it's easy to see that black people dominate sports. But in true reality, there's a lot of different DNA groups that dominate different sports. Now, as for the 4 reasons, the first reason is natural selection. If you don't know what natural selection is, maybe you didn't pay attention to biology, but basically natural selection is when the environment decides what genes survive. For example, you get 2 rabbits. One rabbit is fast and the other rabbit is slow. Now, if both rabbits are being chased by a wolf or a fox, the fast rabbit is more likely to survive because it's faster. So over time, the fast rabbit is probably going to live longer and be able to pass on its genes, while the slow rabbit won't be able to. So as time goes on, there will be more faster rabbits than there are slow rabbits because the environment decides. It's just science. Now in Africa, malaria has killed off so many people, especially in West Africa. And in case you don't know what malaria is,
I got words.
blood from humans and animals, mainly animals, but they also do some blood from humans. And what they do is they suck your blood, but in the process of doing so, they inject their bacteria, which is responsible for malaria. Now, this bacteria likes to infect the red blood cells and then multiply. Now, in West Africa, they have, on average, lower hemoglobin, and also they have the highest cases of sickle cell. That's sickle cell trait and sickle cell anemia. Now, low hemoglobin and sickle cell means you have a problem in your production of red blood cells, which normally is a health problem. But in the case of malaria, it's actually an advantage because there's not enough red blood cells for the malaria to spread throughout the body. So those without those traits likely died out, whereas those with those traits have lived on and passed on their genes. See, natural selection. Now, as a result of low hemoglobin and sickle cell trait causing the low production of red blood cells, black people have less slow twitch muscle fibers. In case you don't know, slow twitch muscle fibers are oxidative. They use aerobic respiration, meaning that they use oxygen. Now, because there's a low percentage of slow twitch muscle fibers, there's a higher percentage of fast twitch muscle fibers, which don't require oxygen. Now, the second reason is the power gene. That's right, our body literally has a gene that helps us to generate power and force. Now, this gene is called ACTN3, and the gene creates a protein called alpha-actinin 3. Now, this protein is what's actually responsible for the power and the force. However, ACTN3 has 2 versions, a good version and a bad version. The good version is the R allele, and the bad version is the X allele. Basically, if you get the R allele from your dad and another R allele from your mom, and you become the RR genotype, you'll be able to create a lot of power and force. If you get the R from your dad and the X from your mom, you'll still be able to produce a good amount of power. Not as good as the RR, but still a good amount of power. On the other hand, if you receive the X from your dad and the X from your mum, you will not be able to produce as much power because your gene is insufficient in creating actinin 3. Now, the XX genotype, people who are XX, not RX, but just XX, completely the insufficient version of the gene, make up around 25% of the Asian population. That means that a quarter of Asians have the XX version, right, which is not the good version. Now, when it comes to white people, it is 18% of white people. That's almost a fifth have the bad version, the XX version. However, when it comes to black people, less than 1% of black people have the bad version, the XX version. That's 3% of black Americans, 2% of Jamaicans, and in West Africa, the percentage of people with the bad version of the gene is around 1%. That means that around 99% of West Africans have the good version of the gene. And just to explain how important this gene is, with elite athletes, with speed and power and strength, not a single one of those athletes don't have the good version of the gene. Now, reason number 3 is myostatin. Myostatin is a hormone that stops your muscles from getting too big. It's not an ally. In fact, it's an enemy of building muscle. Now, sub-Saharan Africans have a higher percentage of myostatin mutations. This means that they're not as limited when it comes to building muscle. Now, the 4th reason is androgen receptors. Without androgen receptors, your muscles won't grow, right? They're literally the limit of growing muscles. Now, black people have a higher androgen receptor sensitivity. This is also why black people are at higher risk of prostate cancer because of their androgen receptor sensitivity. So it's not so good when it comes to prostate cancer, but when it comes to muscle, it seems to be an advantage. That's it. I hope you learned something, and I hope you were informed. Remember, these genetics are not exclusive to West Africans. However, there's a higher concentration of people who have these genetics that are West Africans and their descendants. But there are plenty of people that aren't West African or West African descendants or African descendants or stuff that have been able to make amazing fitness feats. I mean, Arnold Schwarzenegger, one of the faces of bodybuilding, is a white guy. Same with Christophe Lemaitre, who was the first white man to break the 10-second barrier. Su Bingtian, a Chinese sprinter. Apologies if I pronounced the name wrong. But he was the first Asian-born sprinter to break the 10-second barrier. So, yes, there's a high concentration of West African descendants with these genetics, but there are...
Who cleans this best? Tide. Get 3 times the cleaning power when you switch to Tide. Try Puffs Plus lotion for noses that are sore and red and make cold and flu season a soothing time instead.
In this video, I'm going to explain race genetics to the best of my ability. Disclaimer. If you are a racist, a white supremacist, a black supremacist, or any other form of supremacist, get out. I don't want you on my channel. This video is here for education purposes, not for racial discrimination. All people are equal in value. I love everyone, black, white, Asian, and any in between. This video has been highly requested. That's why I made this. I do not preach supremacy or anything like that. Ever since I made my Black Genetics Explained video, many, rightfully so, requested that I cover other groups of people too. By the way, I only made the Black Genetics video because of the countless comments I get on a daily basis about black genetics. If I post my physique, it's because I'm black. If I post my vertical, it's because I'm black. If I do anything, it's because I'm black. So that's why I did that video in the first place, to explain why it seems to be an advantage in certain sports because of race or ethnicity or whatever you deem worthy to classify. If you do not agree and wish to put your own viewpoints out there, feel free to make your own channel and post your own video. Again, I will repeat myself. If you do not want to hear me speak on race, leave. Don't complain in my comment section. Don't spread racism in my comment section. Don't be hypocritical either. Racism goes in every direction. White people to Asian people, white people to black people to Asian people, and black people to white people, and all the in-betweens. So don't disrespect white people, Asian people, or any people. If you don't like white supremacy, don't preach black supremacy or any other form of supremacy. If you do not like racists, do not be racist yourself. I have a zero tolerance for racism, and if you comment at me sideways or anyone or people disrespectfully, you will get blocked. That being said, let's get to it.
Now, let's talk about race. I know that black, white, and Asian is not the most accurate representation of race, so I'm going to break it into different categories or classifications. I know we think our differences may only be skin deep, but the truth is they are. So I'm mainly going to be referring to people from countries in the UK, Scandinavia, USA, and other Nordic countries in Europe as white people. West and Central Africans and their descendants, so African Americans and Afro Caribbeans, as black people, along with East Africans and their descendants as well, like Kenya and Ethiopia. I'll also be going in depth about East Asians and Pacific Islanders. Along with that, I'm also going to be explaining Arabs, South Asians, Latinos, and black people from southern parts of Africa. I'm not able to go in depth about every single group of people simply based on the amount of research that has been done. For example, Native Americans and Aboriginal Australians, as there is not enough research on these people when it comes to sport. Now, the characteristics that make people perform better at specific events and sports are widespread. A lot of people have these characteristics, but there tends to be higher rates of prevalence among specific groups of people. I just wanted to put that out there. There will always be outliers, but the general rule tends to stay the same. That being said, let's get straight into the factors that I'm going to be talking about. So there are various factors that impact people's ability in certain sports. For example, anatomy, muscle fiber types, VO2 max, ACTN3, myostatin, androgens, culture, and money. With anatomy, I'll be referring to body mass, ratio of limbs to torso length, somatotypes, and height. Somatotypes being ectomorphs, mesomorphs, and endomorphs. Ectomorphs are more slender, narrow, and light. They also struggle to put on both muscle and fat. Mesomorphs can be narrow in hips and waist, but they are very prone to building muscle. Endomorphs are stockier and blockier. They put on muscle quite well and are very prone to putting on fat. Muscle fiber types are the different muscle fibers we have. So, slow twitch or type 1 and fast twitch or type 2 muscle fibers. Type 1 slow twitch muscles are slower and weaker, but have a lot of endurance. They are red muscles because of the red blood cells present. They are oxidative, meaning that they use oxygen in aerobic respiration, hence the presence of red blood cells. Slow twitch muscles are useful for long distance running, cycling, football is in soccer, swimming, and some forms of combat depending on the weight classes. Anything requiring endurance. Type 2 fast twitch muscle fibers are faster and stronger, but they have very little endurance. They are white muscles because they lack red blood cells. This is because they are not oxidative.
Wow, I'm sweating so much I can't even do a tip race.
As they use anaerobic respiration. Fast twitch muscles are useful for sprinting, jumping, bodybuilding, powerlifting, strongman, gymnastics, and some forms of combat depending on weight class. Anything requiring speed, strength, or power. VO2 max is your maximum oxygen uptake. So pretty much the maximum amount of oxygen your body can use during exercise. This is an important factor in endurance events because of the oxygen. Remember, slow twitch muscles require oxygen. Fast twitch muscles don't. So yeah, again, this impacts swimming, long distance running, cycling, and some forms of combat depending on weight class. ACTN3. In muscles, there are two main protein filaments that slide across one another to contract, actin and myosin. There are two actin proteins, alpha-actinin 2 and alpha-actinin 3. Alpha-actinin 3 is only expressed in fast twitch muscle fibers and it is responsible for power and speed. The alpha-actinin 3 protein is coded by the ACTN3 gene, also known as the speed gene. The thing is, this gene has a mutation. This is the recessive X allele. Basically, this mutation causes the protein to be read wrong, so therefore it doesn't produce the alpha-actinin 3 protein. This leads to the type 2 muscle fibers not being able to produce as much force. So if you have this bad mutated allele, your muscles won't be as powerful. The other allele is the R allele. This is the good allele, the functional one, that can produce power. If you have two of the good R alleles, so your RR genotype, your muscles will be able to produce a lot of power. If you have one good allele and one bad allele, so the RX genotype, your muscles will still be able to produce a good amount of power. Not as much as the RR genotype, but still a decent amount of power. However, if you have two of the bad allele, XX genotype, your muscles will be bad at producing power. Having the RR genotype helps with recovery and injury prevention. Of course, recovery is key to muscle growth. For example, the testosterone needed is higher post-exercise with RR athletes than with XX athletes. This is relevant in power sports like sprinting, jumping, bodybuilding, powerlifting, and strongman. In fact, 96% of all elite power athletes have at least one R or good allele. In fact, in Olympic power athletes, not a single one has the XX genotype. Next, we have myostatin. Myostatin is a protein that inhibits muscle growth. It is encoded by the myostatin gene. So if you have a mutation in the myostatin gene, your body may not produce as much myostatin. Therefore, you won't be as limited in muscle growth. They've done tests on animals where they removed the myostatin gene to see what happens, and the animals experience insane amounts of muscle growth, even without any exercise. There are many people born with myostatin deficiencies. This leads to myostatin-related muscle hypertrophy without even needing to exercise. This is very useful in bodybuilding and arguably other power sports because of the type 2 muscle fibers being explosive and fast muscles. For muscle building, this is insanely effective. Androgens. Androgens are hormones that regulate male characteristics along with muscle and bone growth, among other things. An example of an important androgen in athletic performance and muscle building potential is testosterone. Androgen receptors are the receptors in cells that interact with androgens. If androgens don't interact with the androgen receptor of a cell, they won't do anything. They are only active by interacting with the androgen receptor. So androgen receptor activity is key to muscle growth. The more activity, the more muscle growth. This also plays a huge role in how your body reacts to androgynous hormones. If you don't have sensitive androgen receptors, you may not react as much to androgynous hormones as someone who does have sensitive androgen receptors. Culture plays a role in which sports groups of people tend to play. If you live in an area where basketball is popular, you're likely going to get into basketball over boxing. If you live in an area where boxing is popular, you're likely going to get into boxing over sprinting. Stuff like that. Money. This impacts representation in sports. This also has an impact on opportunities in sports due to access to facilities and so on. This also has an impact on representation in research, as even in this video, I'm only able to go in depth about races who are well researched. Now, let's get to each race or group of people, whatever way you name it. First up, let's have a look at East Asians. East Asia, along with some countries in the Middle East, dominate Olympic weightlifting. If you look at the Olympic world record holders for men in the lighter weight regions, all tend to be from China, some North Korea, but majority China. Regardless, it's East Asia. When it comes to women, almost all of them are dominated by East Asians. Now, there are three main reasons, and let's have a look at each one individually. First one, anatomy. Asians are the most endomorphic group of people out of all humans. Endomorphs are blockier. This is very useful for powerlifting, as a narrow frame wouldn't be advantageous. They also have shorter limbs. This is very advantageous as the levers of the movement for the limbs are shorter. Shorter levers lead to more power output. Not more strength generation, but more strength utilization. It's the same reason lateral raises are harder than curls, because of the difference in levers. So as a result, the shorter arms and legs put them at an advantage in weightlifting. Shorter limbs also lead to a lower center of gravity. This is optimal for weightlifting. They also are shorter on average. In fact, the average height of the Chinese world record holders ranges from 5'3" or 160 centimeters up to 5'7" or 173 centimeters. Being shorter is an advantage in weightlifting, as the bar doesn't need to move as far for the lifts. You see, if a 5'5" guy did a squat of 200 kilograms and a 6'5" guy did the same, the 6'5" guy would struggle more as the bar path is longer and also the length of the levers, as mentioned earlier. The next reason is their culture. Olympic weightlifting is prioritized a lot by Chinese athletes. As a result, a lot of people are likely to pick it up and train at it rather than other sports. This isn't to say that they do not play other sports though. China also prioritizes the Olympics as a whole a lot and focuses on training athletes from a young age. This leads to the next point, age. Chinese weightlifters tend to start training from a really young age. A lot of them start training from 10. Just like in America, where people people start training for American football and basketball from a young age at school, the same is done in China. Along with that, the children receive proper coaching too, on form and even routine. We also see this in Jamaica when it comes to sprinting. So there is no surprise that they would in turn dominate weightlifting. Let's summarize East Asian genetics and why it's advantageous for weightlifting. They are the most endomorphic people. They are shorter on average. They have shorter limbs in relation to their height. Their culture encourages weightlifting and they start from a very young age. Next up, black people. I'm going to be referring to two groups of black people, not every single group. This is because there are so many groups of black people around the world, but they're not all well researched. So there are black people in pretty much every single continent. There are the Aboriginal Australians, who are black and seen as black by a lot of the people in Australia. Although they have very different DNA to the sub-Saharan African descendants, they are still deemed as black. And when it comes to sub-Saharan African descendants, there are black people in India that have been in India for over 400 years. There are black people all over the Americas and in Europe, right? There's black people in the Middle East because of the Arab slave trade. So there's a lot of black people around the world. However, I'm going to be mainly referring to two groups of black people because of the amount of research that has been done on these two groups of people. So I'll mainly be referring to West and Central Africans and their descendants, and also East Africans, but separately. So let's start with West and Central Africans. So this involves regions like Ghana, Nigeria, Congo, Cameroon, and the descendants thereof like African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans. I'm just going to refer to them all as West Africans. West Africans and their descendants dominate a lot of power sports and events. Not every single power sport or every single power event, but a lot of them. For example, sprinting, basketball, American football, boxing, and MMA. The top 20 sprinters in history are all West African descendants, apart from one who's actually an East African. Over 70% of the NBA and the NFL are black. Many historic greats of boxing are also black, like Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, George Foreman, Larry Holmes, Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield, Lennox Lewis, Deontay Wilder, Anthony Joshua, and so on. Also, overall, we have people like Floyd Mayweather, Zab Judah, and Shane Mosley, etc. They also dominate events like vertical jump and broad jump. Certain other sports like bodybuilding is arguable, though out of the top 4 bodybuilders in history, 3 of them are West African descendants. Of course, the representation is growing as this is also the poorest group of people. So as the money rises, the representation may rise too, as we can see in tennis with Serena Williams and Naomi Osaka. Also, although there is not a lot of black representation in gymnastics, the best female gymnast is Simone Biles, a black woman. Is this a coincidence? Even in the UFC, although there are barely any fighters from Africa, the middleweight, welterweight, and heavyweight champions are all from Africa. As I said, we will continue to see this shift as the income opportunities rise. Now, why is that? There are 7 reasons and 1 myth, and I'm going to go through them. Firstly, let's knock out the myth. Selective breeding during slavery is not the reason at all. There is literally 0 genetic evidence to prove this. It's just a way to say, see, slavery wasn't all bad. By the way, the slavery I'm referring to is American slavery, because there was slavery on the continent of Africa too. That was done by the Dutch, French, British, Portuguese, and Belgians. They don't teach you that in school, but it happened. How come we can notice groups of people in the world for their abilities due to living in climates for thousands of years? But for black people, we need to thank slavery. Firstly, the thought that working for long hours improved our endurance is a lie, because Afro-Caribbeans and African Americans are not the best endurance runners at all. The best endurance runners are East Africans who were not subject to American slavery. That was West and Central Africans. Selective breeding is also not the answer. The fact is, the favorable genetics I will mention are prevalent at higher rates among West and Central Africans who live in Africa, in particular Nigerians, when less people went through American slavery. Also, the reasons you will find out in this video are not characteristics that a slave master could pick out simply by looking at a person. Bearing in mind, they were dumb enough to think that black people